Welcome to another exciting episode of Adventures in DevOps. I am your solo host for the day, Jonathan Hall, but I'm excited to have with me Adam Jacob. Welcome, Adam.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. I'm kind of great. It's a little early. It's 7:30, but it's like early in California, and like it's kind of nice.
Got some coffee?
Like it's like fall happened. I got some coffee.
Awesome.
Like it's good. I'm good.
Ooh. Adam, would you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, where you work maybe, or don't work if that's the case? Just introduce us to what you do.
Sure. I'm Adam. I do work. I'm the CEO of System Initiative, which is a company that's sort of on a mission to rebuild DevOps from the ground up. I previously was the CTO for Chef, and I was the co-founder of Chef. I wrote Chef originally. And before that, I was a systems administrator, which is kind of still what I feel like in my heart. You know, like if you really push on me, the thing that I most identify with as a technology human is as a systems administrator. Like what I do is build complex systems in production and think about the tools and frameworks that help people to do that.
Mm-hmm. So you talk about rebuilding DevOps from the ground up. That means tearing down silos and building better ones, right?
It does mean that, but one of the things that's happened sort of, I think, throughout the DevOps movement was we had this real focus for a long time on the culture instead of the tools. You've heard lots of people say, like, it's the culture that matters. Whatever tools you like or whichever tools you pick, it's all good. But like, get the religion, and then the rest sort of flows from religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of bullshit.
Okay.
I think the truth about culture is that it's what we do. It's not what we say. So it's and what we do all day in our work is deeply informed by the tools that we choose. The way that we choose them and how we put them together is actually a manifestation of the culture we want. We're making a choice about what we do. You see this in programming languages all the time. I don't love Go, not because Go is like a manifestly bad language. It's obviously not, right? But it's just not for me. Culturally, when I'm in the Go community and they're like, what's awesome? Explicit error handling everywhere. I'm like, not awesome. I don't want that at all. And that's a cultural choice. That's me making an aesthetic decision to like join to be a part of what they think is aesthetically beautiful or not. And so when we talk about rebuilding DevOps from the ground up, for me, it's because I think a lot of the aspirations that we had as a movement, where we were like, let's get everybody in the world to be able to deploy tens, hundreds, thousands of times a day with a fast flow of changes in a highly collaborative environment. And let's do that in the biggest companies in the world. Most companies are stuck in the middle. They're deploying once a week, which is still better than what we were doing in 2008. You know what I mean? So it's not like we haven't made progress. But broadly, the way that we've decided to build the system itself, the whole flow of like, how do we move work through the system? How do we use these tools? How do we plug them together? Is sort of leading us to mediocre outcomes. So when we talk about rebuilding DevOps, that's what we mean is like, we need to actually step back and think about that system more holistically and see if we can come up with a way to do the work that provides better outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I identify with a lot of that, except for the part about not liking Go. I love Go, so
I mean, we can still be friends, right?
I don't know. We'll have to see how the rest of this conversation goes.
It depends on how much you love Go, I guess.
So I'm curious, like, how have you re-envisioned DevOps then? I mean, or what's the alternative to what we've been doing that isn't maybe so great?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of things. We've been working on System Initiative for 4 years, and sort of the seeds of it predate that. They sort of dovetail into the tail end of my time at Chef. And to me, the first thing was just a recognition that, how do I best express it? Well, I'll tell a story. So when I left Chef, the moment that I decided I needed to leave Chef was I was in this, and I've told this story before. So, but essentially, I was in this meeting with a bunch of people at a big car company, and they were all like high-level technical executives, and their global CTO was like, here's my hardest automation problem. Here's my like DevOps problem. What do I do? How do I fix it? So I went to a whiteboard and I sketched out what the process is. I was like, here's how your team should work. Here are the tools they're going to use. Here's how you're going to stitch them together. And if you do this and you work this system roughly this way, it's it's going to solve your problem here. It's going to work. And when I turned around, he high-fived me. He was like, "Yeah, great job." And all I wanted to do was go home. I got no dopamine at all from that moment, which you should, right? It's a good moment when that happens to you. And what you do is like, you're a startup CTO and you're like selling software. Like you're supposed to feel good about that moment. And I didn't. And part of why was that I knew that the complexity of the implementation, even of what I had drawn for him, all the different tools he had to stitch together, all the subtle details in the way that they needed to be operated in order for the teams to actually move at the velocity we wanted them to move at, all of the all of the social pieces that needed to change based on how those tools worked, like those were all going to get in their way. It's not that he couldn't understand on a whiteboard how it would work. He did immediately, right? You could do it in 20 minutes. The problem was that when it came time to actually do it, no. Like you were gonna make some kind of decision that caused the whole system to not work as efficiently or as well as it could. And that was what was gonna lead us to mediocre outcomes. It wasn't that like Chef sucked or, Terraform sucks or, their choice of CI system is untenable, right? Each individual tool was doing a good job. And in fact, over the last 10 or 15 years, like we've rebuilt each layer of the stack multiple times, right? So we've made a ton of progress at each individual piece of the puzzle. Um, but the problem isn't the pieces of the puzzle are sucky. And if we made the pieces better, it would work. The problem is the actual system, the way we ask people to work, isn't designed for the crux of the problem. And the crux of the problem is how do you get those people to collaborate together on their problem? How do you take experts of different fields and say, work together to solve this problem? Here's an outcome we're looking for. How do you work together to get there? And the tooling pulls us apart. Um, and if you read the Dora reports and you look at the recommendations, at the heart of those recommendations is always collaboration. It's like how closely together can you get with, other systems administrators, with other, can I call them that? Other DevOps engineers or other developers or security personnel or network engineers or whatever. The closer you get to those people and the more you can collaborate in real time with them, the better the outcomes, the faster we ship. All those things start to happen. But we don't design systems for collaboration. In most people's DevOps workflows, the place that they collaborate is code review, right? Which it's in the name that it's not collaborative, right? It's review. Like you write a thing, I look at it, right? And as the complexity creeps up, the quality of the review goes down, right? Like all of those things, like point the finger at the fact that what's wrong here is the design of the whole system. And so one of the reasons I'm like out in the world now, again, sort of talking to people about DevOps as much as I can is because to your question of like, what's better? What do we do differently? I certainly have a thesis about how we could design a better system. And that's what System Initiative is. But what I really think needs to happen is a burst of creativity from the actual DevOps movement itself. Like, like I have an idea about what I think might be a better answer, but there should be five more. Yeah. Like we actually need like a second wave of DevOps innovation of people just being like, yes, yes. In fact, we know that if you stitch together all these tools the way we've been stitching them together the last 6 or 7 years, we're going to get mediocre outcomes for the majority. Therefore, it's time to break some rules. Something's wrong. And we got to find a thread and tug on it until we see what pops out the other side, because we know we should be getting better outcomes than we are.
I often say that DevOps has become such a almost meaningless term, a lot like
Yeah.
words like agile and I don't know synergy and all the business buzzwords, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Love a
I
good
often
synergy.
yeah, I often say that a simple litmus test for whether you're using DevOps correctly is whether or not you can replace it in a sentence with word collaboration. And everything you just said really sort of drives that home. I think that the
Totally.
collaboration is the key.
And
Uh,
always was. If
yeah,
you go back to
exactly.
watching, John and Paul Hammond at that Flickr talk at Velocity, where they were doing 10 deploys a day, the way that John and Paul put that presentation together is roughly the way that we do DevOps now. I went back and looked at a presentation that predates DevOps that I gave at the Web 2.0 Expo, rest in peace, about building automated infrastructure in 2007. And it laid out how to build a fully automated infrastructure. And it was, whatever, 14 different parts of your infrastructure. It was, operating system deployment and monitoring and trending and configuration management and identity management and backup and restoration, and I could keep going, all the things, right? Um, and uh, and that presentation is essentially still roughly what we're asking people to do. You can swap pieces, um, but we're roughly doing it the way that I told you to do it in 2007. Like, it hasn't actually changed that much from 2007 to 2023 in terms of the way, the culture, the way we actually ask people to do the work. That's interesting, right? Um, I don't think that's because we had it nailed in 2007. In 2007, the number of people who were actually doing that work was quite small, right? Um, and and that we found a path that worked, and then that became how the industry thinks about it is amazing, and I'm so proud of it. But we made it up, like like we just were like, I think here's a way. And we now know, if you sort of extend that out from, John and Paul working closely together at Flickr, they were right next to each other all the time. They were literally right there. And the tools they built together and their teams built together were designed to reinforce the social system they wanted, and it did. Like, if you wanted to deploy, you had to talk to people. Like, there was a conversation that happened. There was a way that flowed. And I think now we're in an era where we can think about rebuilding those tools with collaboration sort of at the center. Um, and if we do, I think what you'll get is dramatically better outcomes. The hard part is that if you use the existing systems to build it, you kind of regress to the mean. Because, if you think about why can't we be better, more collaborative in complex environments, well, infrastructure as code takes all of the dynamic truth of our infrastructure and then turns it into source code, which then becomes a huge base of source code on its own, which then you need to understand the cloud provider, you need to understand the infrastructure as code abstraction, you need to understand the code review piece. And then we ask a developer, yo, pile into this new code base that in and of itself is hundreds, perhaps tens or hundreds of thousands of lines long in a language you don't write in all day. Or maybe it is if you're using Pulumi. And then, but still has a behavior you don't really understand with systems that are foreign to you. And just, take a pass at telling me whether or not this is going to work for your application. Or even perhaps sometimes worse, go to the platform engineering team and then request what you want from them via an API or like a ticket, which is basically what we were doing in 2006, right? It's like a weird regression. And and then let them spin it up for you in the hopes that you can ignore it, which you can't. And so then it won't work, or it won't be fit for purpose, and then you got to spin around, and that whole conversation happens in source code in languages we don't really share or really understand. I'm like, but it's rational how you get there, right? If we say that the only way to automate it is to start out as source code, well, then it's kind of obvious we use code review. It's kind of obvious we use that we got to stitch together our production deployment pipelines in the way that we do, right? Like, a lot of our decisions fall out from each other.
So what? I mean, maybe we can tackle one small piece to give an example of where you think this could or should go.
Yeah.
We talked about code review several times. Like,
Mm.
what's the alternative to me spending a day or whatever writing a feature, create a pull request, send it to you, and then wait for you to look at it? What are the
Yeah.
alternatives to this?
So the way System Initiative works is, rather than having folks write code initially as the source of truth, what we're doing instead is building a big simulation of the infrastructure in your application. So we're basically building a bunch of digital twins. And then at the technical level, like way deep under the hood, it's a big hypergraph of functions. So basically, think about it as like every single property is actually the result of a function execution that has dynamic inputs. So kind of like reactor view, where, right, if there's an input to the function that changes, we automatically rerun the function, recompute the value, and then stick it as an output on this graph. The side effect of all of that is that we can then build new user interfaces on top of the simulation. So, right, if you try to build a new user interface on top of AWS and use that API, you're going to have a bad time, because the API takes forever, right? It might take 10 minutes to provision something, 20 minutes to get a Kubernetes cluster, for example, right? Um, but by building a simulation, we can give you kind of real-time feedback on whether or not what you're building looks like it would work or not, or and we can qualify it immediately. We can infer configuration. There's a bunch we can do, and we do that by putting like a visual interface on top of that model. So you can define the model in code if you want to, or you define it through this visual interface. But either way, when you're doing that work, what you're doing is creating like a change set to reality. So we're tracking like the baseline of what's real, and then we're letting you propose a change on top of it. That happens in this visual interface you can see. And then you can invite other people into it, and the interface is multiplayer. So it works more like Notion or Figma and less like, your editor and GitHub. So and it could even do things like say, hey, if this pull request touches the production database, if this change set touches a production database, then we need to summon a DBA to look at your change, right? And that person can then come into that change set and get the same direct visualization that you got. They can look at the list of, well, here's all the things that changed. Here's all the actions that are proposed to run. Here's the delta between this and reality. And we can keep that thing alive based on the simulation tracking reality, right? In addition to what you've said you want. So you can think of like automatic rebasing as one way to think about it, right? And so suddenly we can move you from code review to reviewing a simulation. So you can bring people in and be like, well, does the simulation say that it would work? Like, what are the impacts of the changes that we've made, right? And the side effect of that is you can get real-time collaboration again. You could get people's voices over the top of a model, and we can interact with it in real time. You could summon an application developer, and they could be like, oh, it's not working. I don't know why. And they could summon an ops person. They could look at the model, and they could change it together, look at the results and what actions it would take, and then apply them. And real, actual collaboration on the actual work in real time.
What has the reception been to this I don't know, you call it a new paradigm, this new approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's very early days. So, and we're careful to say so, right? Like I'm a systems person, and like when people show up in my life and they're like, it's going to change everything, throw all your stuff away, like I don't really believe those people most of the time. So we're very careful not to do that. But what we do have is a very compelling uh model of how this system could work. And you can use it and play with it and be like, hey, I see where this is going and I see why it's cool. And there's a couple of obstacles to overcome. But overall, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. People who try it tend to be like, oh, that's way cooler than I thought. Like it like works much better than I thought that it could. And then you start getting into conversations about like, well, how's the visual part of this gonna scale? Will this scale up to huge infrastructure? And then we start talking about all the different ways that you can scale huge visual tools. We can start talking about layers, and we can start talking about collapsing information, and we can start talking about building more abstract models. Like there's a lot that we've thought about that sort of moves in there. And so, yeah, what we've seen is people being pretty stoked. There's always people who are like, nah. And the people who are like, nope, it tends to be because they're like, you'll pry the source code from my cold dead hands, and that's cool. I get it. I think but conceptually, the response has been pretty fantastic.
So I'm looking at your website.
Yeah.
And you have a little animation there, and you have a video I haven't watched because we're recording right now.
Yeah. No worries.
But like at a high level, it reminds me of the hype around visual programming back in the like 90s.
Totally.
Uh,
Which didn't really work.
Right. I mean, I think, but I think there's like one or two languages that still exist that are used
sure, like
kind
Scratch.
of that way. Yeah. But yeah, by and large, it was a failed paradigm.
Yes.
So explain to me why this is not just superficially the same. What's the difference? Superficially, it looks the same. Tell me that it's not.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
So there's a couple. So one is you're not doing visual programming. So in System Initiative, there's like another little tab there that looks like a little beaker. Mm-hmm. If you click it, what you're in is an IDE. And that IDE is allowing you to write functions on this hypergraph. So like
Okay.
it's a fully programmable system. There's no secrets. It's a power tool built for power users. That's the number one way that the visual programming stuff failed us, was that
Mm-hmm.
it was usually designed to make programming more accessible for the layman.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really designed for power users to do power user things, because it's like a lot harder to
Yeah.
build great tools for power users than it is to simplify. So I'm not on a mission to simplify DevOps. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually think that doing that's a mistake. Like,
Mm-hmm.
DevOps works when you have people working at the height of their expertise together on hard problems. So you have to actually build interfaces that people at the height of their expertise are like, this thing is a chainsaw, right? It
Mm-hmm.
has to be the best thing that they've ever touched for the problem that's at hand, if you want them to use it, because
Mm-hmm.
they get to choose what tools they use because they're experts. Um, so one of the things about it is that, right, the fundamentals is this hypergraph of functions. So the whole system is programmable. So, and it's programmable in the same way that, like, if you watch those old like Alan Kay videos of like Xerox PARC, and they like pull up a small talk machine and they change how the operating system works by clicking a button. It's like that,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is super cool. And the visual component of it, what we're doing there isn't forcing you to use a visual composer. What we're doing is expressing relationships, not programming. So you're not
Mm-hmm.
using that diagram to like to express the programming of infrastructure as code. Instead, what you're doing is saying there's a relationship between this Docker image and the Kubernetes deployment that runs it, and the AMI that we bake that has that Docker image in it at the same time. And I want to express that relationship by drawing this line, this edge between two things visually. And that edge represents information, right? So what it's actually representing is a flow of data, in this hypergraph of functions. It's a literal input to a function, which then is going to then generate new information. So for example, the demo app that we have people do is deploy a little cat adoption website, to EC2, and then it lives in a container. And one of the fun things that it does is, if you expose a port on that container and then you wire that container to a load balancer in AWS, what it does is automatically infer that what you want to do is load balance that port on that pool, right? And you don't have to think about it. And if you change that port number in the Docker image, it'll automatically change everywhere that value needs to, even though that value has very different syntax between Docker and
Mm-hmm.
AWS, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
expressed completely differently. That's because there's this big hypergraph of functions that are doing all this transformation under the hood. And all that stuff is programmable to you. So we're really careful that the way you interact with the system as a user tends to be in the most effective way we can build it. So we're building the most effective interface we can for letting experts interact. And then when it comes time to actually change how the system behaves, straight to source code.
How much is doable right now with the system you have now? I mean, you talked about a lot of things aren't there yet. It's some of it's aspirational, but
Yeah.
what is concrete right now?
Yeah. So right now there's a couple of things. There's maybe 30 different resources, primarily AWS, that are pretty well modeled. We're putting a lot of effort into making the experience of authoring new assets. So getting new things into the model to be really good, so that we
Mm-hmm.
can let people collaborate more directly, both with us and with each other. There's a little contribute button in the UI. If you click it, it'll like, the goal is that you can click it and it will then just like submit it to a module index, and then you can share those things really directly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's some work to do on just making that experience as great as we can, because the way the platform works like really does benefit from it being embedded in the product. But building a great software development experience inside the product is also hard work. So we're doing a lot there. Another is, and those assets are at varying degrees of completeness, right? So, the first things we chose were like deploying containers on EC2, because it's sort of fun to model, and has a lot of externalities, but it's sort of small enough to get your fingers around. But like yesterday, we were tinkering around with like modeling Lambda functions, right? Um, but things like IAM rules, a lot of those things are there. The big hurdle right now is a bit of performance um, and sort of production suitability. So we know that the way that we're running some of that engine has some problems. So we're sort of in mid-engine rebuild, basically, to make that engine more efficient. But that's really the big thing that's in the way of people using it in production right now.
Hmm.
Um, the other is sort of secrets. So the way that those functions execute and get their authentication requires a little bit of, let's just call it manual intervention, that is being replaced. So you'll be able to like actually put secrets in the system and then flow them through safely. So there's
All
a
right.
couple of those things that are really what's in the way.
Hmm.
But progress is fast. So every couple of you can see every week if you hang out in our Discord channel, like there's like a long report of what happened last week. There's new demos all the time, like
Hmm.
tons of content happening on YouTube. Like it's moving pretty quickly.
Cool.
But yeah, and when it's ready, we'll say so really loudly. If you go to the website, we say really clearly it's not ready, right? We're
Yeah.
like, you got to want to come on the exploratory journey with us today, which people do want to come, and it's so fucking fun. So
Yeah.
if you're one of those people and you're like, oh, I want to hang out here and do this, like come hang out with us because it's super fun.
And the website is systeminit.com for
Hmm.
anybody who wants to go hang out and check it out.
Yeah.
What's the learning curve like? If somebody's hearing about this for the first time, realistically, how long will it take them to start doing something? Let's say interesting, since it's not really ready yet. But how long will it take
Yeah.
them to be doing something interesting?
Not very long. So today, you sign up for an account, you download a launcher, and then it launches System Initiative and Docker containers on your local gear. Eventually, that'll be multi-tenant SaaS, and you'll be
Hmm.
able to just directly get started. But from the moment that you start to like deploying that CAT adoption website in EC2 with like new SSH keys and EC2 instances and load balancers and security groups and like all the things that you need, regions, like you can do that in minutes. So, there's a tutorial that walks you through it in sort of painstaking detail because we're trying to teach
Hmm.
you how all the pieces work. But but if you know how to do it, like it minutes to mock out one of those things in like real detail and see that it would work and then apply it. So the getting started loop is pretty short already and sort of getting tighter. Um, the thing you have to do though, you do have to know what you want.
Hmm.
So, like I said before, it's not a tool that is designed for like a citizen developer who's like, I don't know how EC2 works. I don't understand AWS. I don't know what all this infrastructure is. I can just come to this thing and it guides me with guide rails. And that's not what's happening at all, right? It's like, here's a big pile of all the services they're modeled in full fidelity. So they've got all the knobs and buttons that AWS expresses. One of the cool things that you can do with System Initiative, because of the way the model works, there's a lot of API service in AWS that you can't see in tools like Terraform because the
Oh, yeah.
declarative model hides them from you. So things like, updating tags in a non-destructive way, which sounds obvious. Like that's super easy in System Initiative. You can just update the tags and then call an action that is update the tags, and then it'll do it for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of that stuff sort of hiding inside the system that makes it pretty approachable and easy. Um, we've seen very few people bounce. In some of the early user studies, you know, we would have conversations like, it feels slow. And we'd ask them, okay, is that because it's slow? And when they thought about it, the answer is no, right? When it's like, well, how do I go from like if I had to open an editor and do this work, like it would take much longer than it's taking me to do it in System Initiative. The difference is that I know my editor really well. And so there's this like moment, there is this bumpy moment where you're like, huh, like I have all these tools in my tool bag, and suddenly I have this other thing that does everything that my old tools were doing, but does them very differently than I was. And there's a bit of cognitive shear there for sure.
Yeah.
Um, um, but I think overall the experience is pretty solid.
Cool. So I see on the front of your website, let me get back to it here. On the front page is a section about open source. Talk to
Yeah,
me about how open source relates to this. Is this an open source project? I see you're going to be charging for it after the beta is over, presumably.
we are.
Um, what what's your business model as it relates to open source?
Yeah. So it's essentially the Red Hat model. And I can describe that sort of in more
Mm-hmm.
detail. But what we do, System Initiative is a product that System Initiative, the company, System Initiative Inc., makes. Um, and all the software that is in that product is open source under the Apache license. Not some of it, all of it.
Hmm.
So, someday we're going to write billing integrations, right? Those billing integrations will be open source. Like none of it's going to be proprietary.
Okay.
But we reserve the right to build System Initiative. So the product we make is System Initiative. We distribute it under our own proprietary terms, right? So we decide like what the price is. If you want System Initiative from me, you're going to pay me for it, or you're going to accept it under the terms that I want to give it to you. That may
Hmm.
be $0, right? I may be like, hey, there's a free tier,
Hmm.
Um, but the software is all open source. So if you, Jonathan, are like, that's amazing, I love System Initiative, I don't like Adam's terms, not a fan of the way that those terms exist, then what you're going to do is create a new distribution of System Initiative. You'll call it Jonathan Town,
Yeah.
and you'll distribute Jonathan Town. You can take all the same software I do. You want to run a SaaS just like I run a SaaS, compete with me, go ahead. I can't
Mhm.
wait to see Jonathan Town in the world. What I want from you in that instance is to collaborate with me upstream. Like, I want to build that thing together, uh, and do that work together as a community, and which will make us stronger. Um, so yeah, how we monetize it is I sell a product, System Initiative. You can buy it from me for money. We're going to be really good at building it and running it. We also want anyone who wants to use System Initiative for whatever reason they want to use it to do that.
Yeah.
And that's going to make the whole pie bigger for everyone. And that's what's going to make us a giant company.
Awesome.
And that that alignment to that flywheel is very important to us. So so yeah, our plan is to open source all of the software forever, and never have any of it be proprietary.
How do you, or maybe you don't
Well, the
yet, but
software, not
in
the
the
product.
future, how could you dog food this system? Like, can you build System Initiative using System Initiative?
I mean, yes and no. So it's not, to your question about it being not a visual programming paradigm. Like,
Yeah.
a lot of the backend services are written in Rust,
Yeah.
and the UI is written in Vue and TypeScript. And like, there is an editor, like a code editor in System
Uh huh.
Initiative, and it does have change sets. And I suppose you could try to like bang it into shape in a way that allow you to develop System Initiative with System Initiative, but like probably not. Um, I think what you will be able to do, and what we already are doing, is using System Initiative to run the SaaS that is System Initiative, right?
Yeah.
So that's totally correct. Like that's absolutely what we're going to do, right? Because that's the
Hmm.
exact kind of work that you want people using System Initiative to do. So 100%, that's how internally we work. And the early returns on that are that it's, can I swear? Is swearing cool? It's fucking sick.
It's already happened. It's
Oh,
so
it
yeah.
already did
Might as
happen.
well. Yeah.
Sorry, I should
Yeah.
have asked before I did it. But sorry, editor, if you have to
If it's
bleep
a
it out.
problem, we'll bleep it out. I don't know if it's a
Yeah.
problem.
Anyway, it's sick. It's awesome. And I think yeah, so yeah, I think eventually you'll see people using System Initiative to run System Initiative.
Yeah.
And to me in open source, the part that's most important as it relates to open source is really just that if this is as big a shift as I believe it can be, like I think we're really right about how this model works and the change it can sort of make on our day-to-day lives and on the way we express this culture that we all love.
Hmm.
And if that's true, it can't it can't just be about me.
Hmm.
It can't just be about System Initiative, the company making money. It will. And hopefully it makes a ton of it and is life changing for everyone involved. Like
Yeah.
I'm very clear that that's what I want. And that's going to happen because other people will also pick that thing up and use it to change their lives.
Yeah.
And we need to embrace the truth that that's what open source is for. Um, and not be upset when it changes their lives in like if it changes your life, that's not at the expense of mine. Yeah.
Right.
And I think we've sort of gotten into a loop lately in especially large open source companies, where they've kind of forgotten that. Like because it's harder to put that on a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
It's harder to put on a spreadsheet like what's the uplift that we got from, HashiCorp being open source and Terraform being broadly adopted, and lots of people putting their time and effort into evangelizing that tool and using it in their lives and embracing it in the fabric of their careers. Only now it's not a thing that they can embrace in the fabric of their career in the same way anymore. And
Hmm.
like, were they duped? Did they feel, how do you feel when that happens to you? And so I think if it's going to be a change on the order of magnitude, we hope that it is. It has to be open source, and it has to be open source in a way that allows people to thrive in ways that I can't predict.
Well, why don't you do a shout out how people can find the product again? We already mentioned the website, but are you on? Can we follow you on social media? On
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so you can find System Initiative at systeminit.com. You can find me on social media. I'm most active on Twitter. I'm Adam HJK on Twitter or X or whatever we have to call it nowadays. Um, I'm also on like Blue Sky and Mastodon. I'm not hard to find. Um, you can follow System Initiative on YouTube if you want to check out what we're doing week over week. You can also come join the Discord. There's a pretty lively Discord full of folks talking about both System Initiative itself, but also sort of broader DevOps problems. Um, and yeah, and on adventures in DevOps.
and
You can find
Adventures
me
in
there too.
DevOps. Yeah, awesome,
Yeah.
cool. Well, one thing we like to do with this show is picks, and I think System Initiative sounds like an amazing pick. We've already covered that ground, though. Do
Sure.
you have a pick you'd like to share with our audience today?
Yeah, so I have two, neither one of which are
Awesome,
technology.
awesome.
Um, so one is music. So there's a band called Beartooth, which is like a metalcore band called Beartooth. Beartooth Records historically pretty dark. Let's just call them dark. And
Okay,
their like main songwriter, vocalist, sort of had a life epiphany where he like moved to California and got sober and realized that he could like maybe be a good person who is happy. And so wrote a whole record about kind of becoming happy. And it's great. It's called The Surface. So you should listen to that. It has a song on it called I Think I Might Love Myself, which is like a poppy metalcore song. It's pretty good.
okay,
Um,
cool.
so that's one pick. And the other is I'm prepping a Traveler game. So Traveler's an old science fiction role playing game. Come
Okay.
like all the way back from the 70s. Um, there's a great version of it that Mongoose publishes now. And I'm having a bunch of fun prepping a Traveler game. So you should play
Cool,
Traveler.
awesome. Well, I'm going to pick two things also. Slightly related to the topic today, I'm picking a book. I think I picked it before, but it's a great book. Modern Software Engineering by Dave Farley. Came out,
Yeah.
or I don't remember, earlier this year or last year. Um, and it talked about a lot of the same sort of stuff that you talked about. Of course, he doesn't talk about the paradigm that you do, but just sort of how to do development in a way that isn't slow and annoying and and
Hmm.
dumb. So it's a great book. Um, and my other pick, I'm going to pick a game. I have a Steam Deck that I've been using lately, and Diablo 4 just came out on the Steam Deck. It's been out for a while if you don't use the Steam Deck, but I was too lazy to bother. So I've been playing Diablo 4. I played all the other Diablo games. It's kind of a nostalgia trip, so I'm
It
enjoying
is
that
a
one
bit of
as
a
my pick.
nostalgia trip. It's dark though.
Yeah.
Diablo, like it's like everywhere you go, it's grimdark. You're
Yep.
like, it's a new village. We're starving to death. Like
Yes.
they're like it's Diabloing. You know. Um, did you play Vampire Survivors?
I have not played that one, no.
That's another excellent Steam Deck pick.
All right. I'll
Vampire
keep that in mind.
Survivors, fabulous game. You basically like run around shooting. Like you don't actually control when you shoot. Your character just like shoots on an interval,
Oh,
and you pick
okay.
up random weapons that then become all the different bursts of particles that are flying all over the screen as giant
Okay.
mobs of zombies come attacking you, and you just try to see how long you can survive. If you make it
Interesting.
half an hour, you win.
Okay.
But then there's this shocking amount of depth that unveils itself. Like it's a really lovely, well designed game.
I'll check it out. Thanks for the recommendation. Got a bonus pick there at the end. Cool. Well,
Totally.
thanks, Adam, for coming on. It's been a pleasure. I
You
wish you
as
the
well.
best of luck with System Initiative, and I'll be checking it out. It looks pretty interesting. So
Great.
thanks for sharing with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.